What you call corporate culture was designed by people who believed they were building something that could outlive any human being in the room. There is a practice so embedded in the architecture of modern institutions that most people inside those institutions would defend it without being able to explain why it exists. Not what it accomplishes strategically, not what it produces psychologically, just that it has always been done this way, that it is simply how things are done here. That phrase, how things are done here, is one of the oldest mechanisms of initiated knowledge ever recorded. It appears in Pythagorean brotherhoods in the 5th century BC. It appears in the organizational manuals of medieval guild systems. It appears in the founding charters of Freemasonic lodges in 18th century London. And it appears, almost word for word, in the onboarding documents of some of the most powerful technology companies operating right now. This is not a coincidence. It is a transmission. The question is not whether these institutions borrowed from older traditions. The question is whether they knew they were borrowing, and what they believed those traditions were actually doing when they structured human behavior in precisely this way. Wait, because the answer to that question changes everything that comes after it. The oldest documented use of closed belief systems as organizational technology comes from ancient Egypt, specifically from the administrative structure of temple priesthoods. These were not purely religious institutions. They were the most sophisticated bureaucracies of the ancient world, managing agriculture, medicine, architecture, and trade simultaneously. Their organizational secret was not the gods they worshipped. It was the tiered access structure that determined who knew what and when. Knowledge was distributed in layers. Each layer believed it had the full picture. None of them did. John Dee understood this with uncommon precision. Mathematician, intelligence operative, and the most influential occult philosopher of the Elizabethan era, Dee spent decades mapping the connection between esoteric knowledge structures and institutional power. He advised Queen Elizabeth I not merely on navigation and statecraft, but on what he called the architecture of invisible empire, the idea that the most durable power is never the power that announces itself. It is the power that organizes the conditions under which others make their decisions. Dee did not invent this idea. He inherited it, formalized it, and delivered it directly into the hands of the people building the first modern institutions of the Western world. The people who designed that system understood something that modern organizational psychology is only beginning to formalize. Humans perform with more commitment, more loyalty, and more creative intensity when they believe they are participating in something larger than themselves, and when full understanding is always slightly beyond their current reach. That is not manipulation as most people understand it. That is architecture, and the same architecture is running inside the institutions that shape your daily decisions right now. Here's something no one tells you about the world's most powerful boardrooms. The decisions made inside them are almost never made inside them. The room where the vote happens is not the room where the outcome is determined. The formal meeting, with its agenda, its minutes, its recorded votes, is the ritual of legitimacy. The actual decision was made somewhere else, in a different kind of space, governed by a different kind of logic. This pattern appears with such consistency across centuries and cultures that researchers studying elite decision-making have a term for it: the separation of sacred and profane space. Sacred space is where real authority operates. Profane space is where it is performed for those who need to see it perform. In ancient Rome, the augurs, priests who interpreted divine will through the behavior of birds and atmospheric signs, were not peripheral figures in Roman political life. They were central to it. No military campaign could be launched. No law could be passed. No magistrate could take office without augural consultation. The augurs did not make decisions. They legitimized them. The decision had already been made. The ritual provided the architecture within which that decision became real, binding, and unquestionable. The structure of modern institutional decision-making is not a descendant of Roman augury by accident. Several of the intellectual architects of Western legal and corporate tradition were deeply familiar with classical Roman religious and political structures. They did not copy the birds. They kept the architecture. What they preserved, with extraordinary precision, Was a closed system, a structure in which the logic governing decisions at the highest level remains invisible to everyone operating below a certain threshold of access. Not because the information is hidden in a vault somewhere, because the system itself is designed so that the question never occurs to most of the people inside it. That is not conspiracy, that is architecture, and it is the most durable form of power ever documented across human history. That is not a metaphor. The historical record points to an intellectual inheritance too specific to be coincidental, one that can be traced through names, dates, and organizational structures that survive the transition from esoteric tradition to modern institution with remarkable precision. But here is what almost no one notices about that inheritance. The separation of sacred and profane space inside institutions does not require that anyone at the top believes in anything supernatural. It only requires that everyone at every level behaves as if certain spaces, certain moments, and certain individuals operate under different rules. The belief is structural, not personal. You do not have to believe in the ritual for the ritual to work on you. This is where the psychology becomes genuinely unsettling. Research in behavioral economics and social cognition consistently demonstrates that ritual behavior, defined as action performed in a specific sequence, in a specific context, regardless of causal connection to outcomes, produces measurable changes in confidence, risk tolerance, and group cohesion. The ritual does not need a metaphysical foundation to produce real psychological effects. It only needs to be performed. The people who built the first institutional rituals of the modern West knew this, not because they had access to neuroscience, because they had access to something older, centuries of documented observation of how human beings actually behave when placed inside symbolic systems. If this is shifting something in how you see the institutions around you, the light tells the algorithm this kind of investigation matters. It keeps this work alive. Now here is where the logic breaks open. Because if ritual behavior produces real psychological effects independently of belief, if the structure works regardless of whether anyone inside it understands why, then something follows from that which most people are not prepared to sit with. You do not need to be at the top of an institution to be inside its ritual system. You are inside it the moment you internalize its language, the moment you begin using its vocabulary without questioning where that vocabulary came from, the moment you feel, in a context that institution created, that certain questions cannot be asked. Not because anyone told you not to ask them, because the architecture made asking feel unnecessary. This is what esoteric traditions across history called the uninitiated state. Not ignorance in the ordinary sense, something more specific, a mode of participation in a system whose deeper structure remains invisible to the participant. The initiated and the uninitiated can be in the same room, doing the same work. The difference is not intelligence. It is the capacity to see the architecture of the space they are both inside. The Hermetic tradition, which directly influenced the organizational philosophy of several founding figures of modern corporate and financial structures, described this as the difference between operating a symbol and being operated by one. Both are real states. Both produce measurable outcomes. Only one of them involves any degree of agency. The question is not which institutions are doing this deliberately. That question leads nowhere useful. The more precise question is this: what changes in your behavior, your decisions, and your sense of possibility when you can name the structure you are inside? And that question has an answer, a documented one. Across traditions from Stoic philosophy to Sufi cognitive practice to modern metacognition research, the answer is consistent. Naming a pattern does not eliminate its influence, but it creates the possibility of a response that was not available before. That distinction between automatic response and conscious response to the same symbolic stimulus is the actual subject of what has historically been called esoteric knowledge. Not spells, not supernatural power. The ability to see the architecture while you are inside it, and to choose, with that visibility, what you do next. There is one more layer here, and it is the one that connects everything else. The closed belief systems operating inside modern institutions are not static. They evolve. They absorb new language, new symbols, and new legitimizing structures, and they do it at the exact pace required to remain invisible to each new generation entering the institution. In the 20th century, the legitimizing language was scientific management and corporate psychology. In the first 2 decades of the 21st century became startup culture, innovation, mythology, and the language of disruption. Each iteration used different words to maintain the same structural separation: those who understand what the institution is actually doing, and those who understand only what they have been given permission to understand. The newest layer is the most sophisticated one yet, because the language of artificial intelligence, of systems that process patterns humans cannot see, make decisions humans cannot fully audit, and operate with an authority derived from scale rather than from any individual human judgment, maps almost perfectly onto the oldest descriptions of how institutional sacred knowledge was supposed to function, not as a conspiracy, as a structural recurrence. The same architecture finding the most advanced available language to express itself. What you call an algorithm was described, with different words, in texts that are centuries old. The mechanism is the same: an entity that processes inputs, produces outputs, and is consulted as an authority by people who do not have access to its internal logic. The oracle at Delphi did not explain its reasoning either. This investigation does not end here. What has been opened today is a single layer of something with considerably more depth below it. The next layer involves specific documented cases, names, institutions, dates, where the transmission between ancient organizational philosophy and modern corporate structure is not inferred. It is explicit. If you want to be there when that layer opens, subscribe and turn on notifications, not because you should, because what comes next will make what you just watched feel like the introduction it actually is. You have been inside this architecture your entire life. The only thing that just changed is that now you have a name for it, and that changes everything about what you can do next.